Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janean Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Hello, friends. I'm so excited to talk with you all again. First, I want to start by saying thank you so much for the warm welcome you've given the podcast. The podcast ranked in the new and noteworthy section of iTunes in less than 24 hours, which is pretty darn impressive, and that's all thanks to you. I know some of you listen to the podcast directly on my website, which is eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, and thank you for that. If you're interested in listening through iTunes, but you're not sure how, I'll just explain briefly for you, because I've had several people mention that in the past few days. Somebody just told me that they're an iTunes dinosaur, so I thought I'd give a brief how-to. You can listen to the podcast through iTunes on your desktop computer by opening iTunes and searching in the search bar in the top right corner. So when you do that, click on the tab that says Search in iTunes Store, and then type Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast in the box. The podcast will show up in the search results. Click on the icon for the podcast, and once you're there, click on the button that says subscribe. You can also listen to the podcast on your iPhone. On your iPhone, find the podcast app. It's one of the native apps, meaning that it's automatically on your iPhone if you have a phone. It's purple and it looks like it has a little antenna on it. So click on that app, and then same thing, click the search button at the bottom. And this is just like the desktop version. Search for Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. Once the podcast icon pops up, click on it. And then when you get to that, click on the subscribe button. Subscribing on iTunes is important for the podcast because the podcast shows up more easily in searches when more people are subscribed, which means that more people who could benefit from listening to the podcast will be able to fit more easily. Also, subscribing is cool because once you're subscribed, the episodes will automatically show up in your iTunes account on your phone, which is pretty darn convenient. And that's great because a lot of other things about recovery are inconvenient and hard and take a long time. So this is an easy thing. I also wanted to talk with you about the comments and feedback I've received about the podcast thus far. I'm so happy to hear that you all are enjoying it and finding it helpful. I've had lots of people say, I don't have an eating disorder, but I love listening to the podcast anyway. That's awesome. I heard some folks say that they're in recovery and really like the info and the support they're getting from it. That's wonderful. I've heard other people say that they have loved ones who have eating disorders or who are in treatment and that they recommended the podcast to them. That's amazing. I also heard from a bunch of you saying, I used to struggle with an eating disorder. Now I feel pretty good, but I still really love the podcast. So thank you all so much. Those sort of things are what I wished would happen with the podcast, and I'm thrilled you're finding it helpful. Oh, and lots of providers, therapists and dietitians, let me know that they've recommended it to their clients, and that is such a compliment. Some of them were recommending it as homework for therapy, which is great. I know some of you, the providers, want materials to hand out to your clients when you recommend the podcast. So my co-producer and I are working on getting some printed materials for you to hand out to your clients so they have something to take with them that explains where they can find the podcast. So if you're a treatment provider and you would like materials mailed to you, please email us. Our email is podcast@eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, and we will get you those as soon as we can, basically as soon as they're ready. For listeners who aren't treatment providers, I'd love to hear from you, as to continue to hear from you. Lots of you have reached out to me on social media, which has been so much fun to get to talk with you. Several of you have contacted me and let me know that there are topics you'd like for me to talk about, which is extremely helpful for me to know what you're interested in and what you want to learn more about. Especially because I'm so immersed in the field, sometimes it's difficult for me to tell for people who, don't do this job, what might be more interesting or helpful to them, and kind of, where to start with these podcast episodes. Because I could talk forever about this, which is why I have a podcast. So I want to let everyone know that if they have a request for what they would like to hear about on the podcast, if there's a question you have, or you just want to bring up a specific topic with me, the best way to contact me is if you just email the podcast, please. So again, that email is podcast@eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast. Everything you want to know about the podcast is on that website, eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com. I want to let everybody know as well that there have been multiple requests, like a lot of requests for a podcast about friends and family, or how to help a loved one who has an eating disorder, or just generally how to talk in a way that's not food shaming and is more body positive. I'm all over that. I'm working on that episode. So that episode or multiple episodes will definitely be coming along a little bit longer with the friends and family one, because I want to really think through the material and make sure I cover enough for all of you. I just really want to do that one very, very well. So just know it's on my radar, and it is definitely on. So, okay, enough business stuff. Let's get to today's episode. Episode 6 is called Recovering Your Perspective. You are not your eating disorder. Today's episode is all about how eating disorders tangle up our thoughts with thoughts that are solely the product of having an eating disorder. Like if you didn't have an eating disorder, you would not be thinking that thought. So this is not an original concept, the idea that you and your eating disorder are totally separate. In fact, it's been around for many, many years and has been talked about in a bunch of different ways by various people in the field, commonly talked about in outpatient treatment and at treatment centers. I want to give a shout out to the good people of Eating Disorder Center of Denver and their affiliate centers. They have a whole campaign now, right? That's on social media. You may have seen me use the hashtag defining me. And their whole thing is about getting back to your authentic self and recovering your authentic self and separating that out from the eating disorder go. So I just wanted to give a shout out to EDCD for all the awesome work they do. Like, how cool is that a treatment center has that as a campaign that they're doing? We'll talk more about kind of those activities that they do with the Defining Me campaign, I'm sure, in the future. Another talked about this separation of your authentic self from your eating disorder is the fantastic, fabulous Jenny Schaefer, who's the author of Life Without Ed. If you have not read that book, you need to go buy that immediately and read it. It's like one of those cornerstone eating disorder recovery, just like Dr. Anita Johnston's book, Eating in the Light of the Moon. Just go get that, go read it. It will help you so much. Jenny Schaefer's book, Life Without Ed, talks about her recovery story and the process of separating her authentic self from her disorder. Also, if you haven't seen her speak at a live event, I would definitely get tickets to that as well. She is fantastic. I just saw her speak at my beloved alma mater, Colorado State University, and it was wonderful. So not a new concept. There's tons of it out there. And I consider this separating yourself from your eating disorder to be a foundational concept for recovery. So this lays the groundwork to a bunch of other work that you're going to do on yourself in recovery. Foundational concept are not your eating disorder. You and your eating disorder are not the same. I know there are people out there listening to this podcast who are thinking, they feel the same to me, or I can't tell them apart. I don't know where my authentic self ends and my eating disorder begins. So I hear ya. And I've heard this many, many, many times from my clients. Some of the people I work with can remember a time in their life before they had an eating disorder when they were more in touch with their authentic self, but a lot of them can't. They can't recall a time when the eating disorder wasn't around. So for those of you who can't even remember a time when the eating disorder wasn't in your life, there is hope. I truly believe that even if that's the case, you can pull those parts apart. You can pull away yourself from that eating disorder. Let's talk about each of those parts. First, authentic self. What exactly? Besides a totally hokey therapy sounding word, some people call the authentic self your true self, or as our dear friend Dr. Anita Johnston calls it, your soul self. The authentic self, you really are at your core. Your authentic self is the part of you that comes out to play when you're not worried about judgment. It's the part of you that wants to nourish yourself and your body, not punish it. You experience yourself when you do things that line up with who you are. The authentic self is the part of you that has nothing to do with your eating disorder. Your authentic self predates your eating disorder, and it will outlast your eating disorder. Now, we're going to shift to the other part. We're going to shift to talking about the eating disorder. My stance is that the eating disorder isn't actually a part of you. It's not part of your authentic self. You didn't arrive on this earth a precious newborn baby with an eating disorder. Your eating disorder isn't your soul self. Your eating disorder is something that developed, became a huge part of your life. It became so big, in fact, that sometimes you can't even see underneath it to see who you are, to see that authenticity. And as sad and confusing as this can feel, it's also a really common experience for people with eating disorders. So why do our authentic selves and our eating disorder selves get tangled up? So much so that sometimes we can't even tell them apart. It's because eating disorders take up so much mental space. They take up so much emotional energy. When we spend our entire day thinking order thoughts like obsessing over rigid food rules, or stressing out about how many calories we ate, or freaking out over what we might have to eat in front of other people at a dinner party later that night, to confuse these thoughts with our true self. Because the eating disorder takes up what seems like all of our mental and emotional room, it starts to seem like this is part of who we are. And after entire days of eating disorder thoughts, those eating disorder thoughts morph into entire weeks of eating disorder thoughts, entire months of eating disorder thoughts, years of eating disorder thoughts, and we begin to think the eating disorder is who we are. But it's not. That's why I talk about this phrase, recovering your perspective. And that's why I wrote a book entitled my book, about this whole topic. The eating disorder will take up all of your head space, all of your heart space, and causes you to completely lose perspective. You lose the perspective of your authentic self. So when you have an eating disorder, now you see things through that eating disorder's perspective, not the perspective of your authentic soul self. For example, you used to see your favorite fruit as just that, your favorite fruit. But after the eating disorder arrived, you now see it as too carby. I forget who taught me that word, too carby. Or another example, you used to exercise as this fun thing that you got to do because it improved your mood, or you wanted to play a sport with friends, or play outside. But after the eating disorder, you see it as a chore, a punishment, a way to undo what you ate that day. Now you're seeing the exercise through the eating disorder's lens, the eating disorder's perspective, not your own, not your authentic perspective. If you didn't have an eating disorder, you would think about exercise and your favorite fruit in a different way. That's why I think it's helpful to recover your perspective, not the eating disorder's perspective. To get back to the view you would actually have if the eating disorder wasn't blocking your line of sight. I think recovering your perspective is the process of graduating back to your true self instead of seeing things only through the eyes of your eating disorder. So here's the deal. When you have an eating disorder, we know that the eating disorder will produce a predictable of thoughts that spurn eating disorder behaviors, like restricting, binging, purging. Actually, so my whole book is about outlining the specific thought patterns and giving them names so you can identify them and pull them apart from your true self. And we're going to talk concepts on the podcast at one point or another, just like we did in episode 5 with All or None Thinking when the fabulous Kate Merkel joined us. This episode is mainly to introduce the concept so we can talk about it much. So I know a lot of you are probably thinking, I can't possibly even begin to tell my eating disorder apart from me. I know. I've been there, and I've worked with many people who have been there, but I promise you, you can if you're willing to do the work. Sometimes I think of it like a necklace that gets tangled up, or when you have to untangle Christmas lights, holiday lights. I know, untangling is worst, and it takes time. But if you keep at it, you're going to get it figured out. You're going to be able to pull those two necklaces apart, and you are going to be able to pull apart your authentic self from your eating disorder self. And you're going to be able to see things as completely separate and independent of your eating disorder's thoughts. In wrapping up, I want to give you some pointers, some cues that can tip you off to something being an eating disorder thought so you can look. and notice them and call them out for what they are. Eating disorder thoughts, not your thoughts. So here's a very brief overview. A great rule of thumb for identifying eating disorder is asking yourself, does this thought make me want to continue my eating disorder? Or does this thought keep the eating disorder going? If you answer yes, you can mark disorder thought, not an authentic self-thought. So anything that perpetuates the eating disorder by making you use behaviors is the eating disorder talking, not you. For example, if you think I'm not going to eat whatever blah, blah, blah food is, you know that's your eating disorder. Because when you think that thought, I'm so fat, I shouldn't eat this food, it causes you to restrict that food, eating disorder. Or if you think, I'm such a failure, I'll never make it anywhere in life, that's the eating disorder talking too. It's preying upon some common self-esteem fears or doubts about your future, and it wants for you to feel bad about yourself and hopeless about your future, so you will be more likely to restrict or binge or purge or over-exercise. I'm going to do a whole episode on the eating disorder vicious cycle, detail about all this, and I promise I will have a ton of examples for you in that so we can practice identifying those eating disorder thoughts. And you can see the vicious cycle, the setup, how they can keep you using behaviors. And then here's the really vicious cycle. Sorry, I'm already getting into it. See, when you feel really bad and you use eating disorders behaviors, like you restrict or binge or purge, then guess what? You feel really bad about the fact that you used eating disorder behaviors. And then you continue to use behaviors even more. Such a setup. So we're going to do, we'll have at least one episode dedicated to that. But for now, keep that rule in mind. So I'm going to remind you of the rule. Does this thought continue my eating disorder? Does this thought keep the eating disorder? If you answer yes, you can mark it as an eating disorder thought, not an authentic self-thought. So I'm going to also give you a couple other really quick pointers to let you know this might be my eating disorder talking, not my authentic self-talking. So first, discourages you from self-care. It could be an eating disorder thought. When we don't take care of ourselves, we are more likely to use behaviors. Secondly, if a thought discourages you from setting, it could be an eating disorder thought. Boundaries allow us to keep ourselves safe. When we feel unsafe or violated, we are more likely to use behaviors to cope. And finally, prevents you from bringing up or attending to one of your needs. It could be an eating disorder thought. When our needs go unmet, we are more likely to use eating disorder behaviors in an attempt to meet those needs, even though the eating disorder will not truly satisfy them. Again, those are just a few pointers. We will get into so much more detail about this in upcoming episodes. So keep this in emotional concept. This is a concept that's going to underlie a lot of other work that you do in recovery, that your authentic self is totally different from your eating disorder. And your authentic self rocks. So you don't even have to worry about what your authentic self is like. you. It is awesome. So once we can tease out some of those eating disorder thoughts, you're going to feel your authentic self so much more, and you're going to act in accordance with your authentic self. And it's going to feel so healing. And you're going to know, this is the good stuff. So in wrapping up, please write me, email me. It's podcast@eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com. Let me know what you want to hear about, and I will do my best to make it happen. Until then, I'll be thinking of you all. Talk soon, friends. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the Podcast or Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. This podcast is produced by me, Dr. Janean Anderson, and Elise Barbuck.